to the responsibility to protect.
On atrocity prevention.
Words kill.
All societies are potentially vulnerable.
Atrocity crimes.
Timely and appropriate action.
Welcome to Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention by the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I'm Jacqueline Streitfeld Hall, Research Director at the Global Center. This podcast features one-on-one conversations with practitioners from the fields of human rights, conflict prevention, and atrocity prevention. These conversations will give us a glimpse of the personal and professional side of how practitioners approach human rights protection and atrocity prevention, allowing us to explore challenges, identify best practices, and share lessons learned on how we can protect populations more effectively. Today, I'm joined by Nicolas Agostini, representative to the United Nations in Geneva for DefendDefenders, an organization that protects and promotes human rights defenders in the East and Horn of Africa subregion. Thanks for joining us today, Nico.
Thanks for having me.
For those in our audience who don't know you or your organization, can you tell a bit about the work of DefendDefenders?
Sure. So DefendDefenders is the short name. We are actually the Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project. It's a long name. We use DefendDefenders because we protect human rights defenders. So we focus on the Eastern Horn of Africa countries, from basically Sudan in the north to Tanzania in the south, Rwanda, Burundi, and everything east of that. We do, of course, protection of human rights defenders. That's our core mandate. We do capacity building, security management, physical safety, digital safety. We do advocacy at the African and UN levels. We do research and we do networking. We host the Pan-African Human Rights Defenders Network, or African Defenders. That is a continental network.
Excellent. And since you mentioned advocacy and you're the representative in the Geneva space, can you tell a little bit about what work your organization does in mobilizing multilateral response to atrocity crises?
Yeah, so of course I should have mentioned that we are based in Kampala, Uganda. I'm actually the only staff member based outside of Africa. We are about 55 staff members today, mostly in Kampala. We decided to set up an office in Geneva to engage with the UN human rights system all year long. And that was before I joined. Colleagues used to come for Human Rights Council sessions, but they realized that that was not enough, that we needed to have a permanent presence in Geneva to work with the UN human rights system, and in particular the UN Human Rights Council. Given, of course, the gravity of the situation in many of our mandate countries, from Sudan to South Sudan to Somalia to Burundi to Eritrea and Ethiopia. And also to be able to do the groundwork and to talk to decision makers all year long. That is diplomats and, of course, UN experts and officials of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So with that permanent office, we are able to do that, to engage all year long, to try and influence what the Human Rights Council is doing, including in terms of atrocity prevention and response to crises like the one in Sudan. We also coordinate civil society initiatives through our Geneva office, so calls, letters, calls to action to states and UN experts and OHCHR. And we usually coordinate before each and every session of the Human Rights Council. We coordinate civil society letters outlining basically what we would like to see from the Human Rights Council, including in terms of atrocity prevention.
And how do you think the human rights defenders you work with view the role of the UN human rights system in their work on the ground?
It's actually incredibly important for several reasons, for the attention that the UN brings to their country situations, and they often feel that without that attention, their country would be forgotten. Also for the crucial access for victims, survivors, human rights defenders to the UN system. These mechanisms create a link between people in the country and the international level. And simply, of course, I mentioned that we have our permanent office in Geneva, but simply for human rights defenders to be able to come to Geneva during sessions, to be there, to have their voices heard by decision makers, that is, by diplomats that negotiate the resolutions, including the resolutions that create or extend the mandate of international investigative mechanisms. Having their voices heard is incredibly important. And the HRDs we bring to Geneva are often coordinators of networks and coalitions, representatives of victims and survivors, and they work on atrocity prevention, they work on accountability, they work on sexual and gender-based violence. So being here in Geneva, influencing both what civil society does ahead of sessions through calls, letters, initiatives, and influencing negotiations on the resolutions during HRC sessions, including by being in Geneva and talking to diplomats, is incredibly important because it contributes to, of course, not solving the crisis. It's not the HRC in itself and by itself that will solve crises such as the one in Sudan, but it contributes to making sure that human rights are at the center of the international response to these crises.
Given your extensive experience in this area, how do you assess the impact and success of the HRC mandated mechanisms for affected communities? I know that you've advocated for the creation of many of these mechanisms, so obviously you believe in their power. But how do you assess their impact and success?
So I think the answer to that could be in two parts. The first part is the criminal accountability part. I think many of these mechanisms, and now we try to streamline the language and to make sure that the same type of language, of elements, of functions and responsibilities are included in all investigative mechanisms. The criminal accountability part is ensured by the fact that these mandates now have all of them, or almost all of them, the same functions: investigation, collection, and preservation of evidence, establishing the facts and circumstances, but also the root causes of violations, identifying perpetrators, and basically preparing case files for prosecution. That's the criminal accountability part, and we, of course, hope, and the human rights defenders who come to Geneva with us hope that the work done by these mechanisms will lead to criminal accountability. But the second part is more the moral or political aspect of accountability. I would say, and certainly I'm not advocating for that, but I would say even if these mechanisms do not lead to criminal prosecutions, to criminal accountability for those responsible, even in that case, there is an important political accountability function for these mechanisms. It's exposing, documenting, and exposing what happens in these countries, exposing what perpetrators do. And that can, in a sense, be as important for the victims and survivors and for the human rights defenders from the countries concerned, as important as the criminal accountability part. If you look at the behavior of the countries concerned, of the diplomats that represent the governments of the countries concerned at the HRC, you understand that no one likes to be under the spotlight. No one likes to be exposed. They could say, and this is often the standard response, they could say that the reports of these mechanisms are fabricated, are politically motivated, but deep inside, everyone knows that it's not the case because there are established methodologies and tools that ensure the independence and impartiality of these mechanisms. And again, with the functions they have today in terms of collecting, preserving evidence, identifying those responsible, and providing guidance on also on transitional justice. With all these, you have basically a pretty good record of what happened, and this is something that those responsible will never be able to evade. the reports will stay there. When they are launched, there is significant media attention, of course, more or less significant depending on the countries concerned, but there is significant media attention, and this is very important for all those affected, victims, survivors, and also the human rights defenders, the lawyers who work on all these cases.
I think that's an important point to be made, is that, you know, the attention drawn to the cases, drawn to the crises when these reports come out. You know, there's the long-term value of the reports, but there is that kind of instantaneous attention drawn to a crisis when the reports come out. And I think that this pairs well with the next question I was going to ask you, which is, you know, a lot of these situations, there's kind of an ebb and flow of attention. And we've seen situations like, I think Burundi is a great example, where, you know, there were high atrocity risks, high attention on the situation, both internationally as well as within the council itself. The COI had several high impact reports, and then the COI was terminated. Council attention decreased, but the situation remains unchanged. There are still risks there. So, how do you kind of view the impact of the HRC for protracted situations like Burundi that are no longer a priority on the agenda of the HRC, or situations like Sudan, where the kind of international attention really ebbs and flows? There's a mechanism, there's no mechanism, there's a mechanism again.
Yeah, so I mean, this is always the case for all situations. Unfortunately, one situation one day is at the top of the agenda of the HRC, and over time it slips down the list of priorities, and that has been verified for all situations that have been the object of an investigative mechanism. So you mentioned Burundi, 2015, 2016. It was really maximum attention, and it was really one of the top priorities of the Human Rights Council. And over time, of course, the attention decreased, but this is the same for Syria, the oldest investigative mechanism set up by the HRC. This is the case for South Sudan, for Myanmar, for Belarus, for North Korea, for Venezuela, even for Ukraine, and even for the Middle East today. Actually, the attention is less than a few months ago. So beyond what I said before, that the fact that reports exist, they stay there, and those responsible, those who have been identified, will never be able to evade that kind of accountability, the political or moral accountability, as opposed to the criminal accountability. Unfortunately, we know that some of them will evade criminal accountability. So when we take the example of Burundi, we will never know actually exactly what that kind of international attention has prevented. 2015, early 2016, there were a number of reports, including by NGOs, that basically made the case that Burundi was in a situation in which the risk of genocide and crimes against humanity was very high. The Commission of Inquiry has documented a number of atrocities, including acts that may amount to crimes against humanity, but not genocide. But we will never know if that situation would have been the same without the COI. The attention that the COI brought to Burundi, as well as the attention brought by the High Commissioner at the time and other actors, contributed to preventing possibly worse than what we saw. That means genocide. And that's the case in many other situations. So the deterrence aspect is also very important. Of course, it's very difficult to document this. And consistently, I mean, human rights colleagues who listen to us know that very well. It's very difficult, challenging to document the impact of advocacy, especially in the long term. But I think we can. It's also a common sense issue. We can feel that we can have the intuition that kind of maximum international attention sends a message to those who act in the countries concerned on the ground. The message is very simply that your behavior is being watched and you may be held to account in the future, if not criminally, at least politically and morally. So that's, I think, for Burundi, that's very clear. But I think the reasoning could be applied to many other situations.
We've all experienced the highs and lows of working in the multilateral space. And I know that you personally had advocated for over a year to get the investigation into atrocity crimes in Ethiopia. And after that institution was put into place, a year later, the mission was terminated due to lack of political will and a lot of, political maneuvering. Can you share your reflections on the potential of HRC action as well as the challenges and limitations, especially when mechanisms like this are not renewed?
Regarding Burundi, it was about the ICC. Even though the COI on Burundi has been discontinued, it was there for 5 years, which is a long time actually for an investigative mechanism at the HRC level. It was discontinued, but it's provided information to the ICC. And one of the things that has been the most difficult to do is to, for these investigative mechanisms, to reach the level of, standard of proof. It's always reasonable grounds to believe for HRC mechanisms, but to reach also the evidentiary requirements of international courts and tribunals like the ICC. But I think one observation is that over the years, the gap has been bridged to some extent. Investigative mechanisms today use the same standard of proof, which is reasonable grounds to believe, but in terms of evidentiary requirements, they are bridging the gap. They have systems in place to collect and preserve evidence, to keep the chain of custody, and to prevent interference with that chain of custody. That makes it, of course, more difficult for defense lawyers to challenge the evidence collected, for instance, testimonies. And they are more and more equipped with digital tools to preserve the evidence and to make sure that it will be usable in future accountability processes, including in front of international courts and tribunals, ICC, for instance, in front of regional courts and tribunals, and also in front of national courts and tribunals, for instance, in terms of universal jurisdiction. So the gap has been bridged to some extent over the years. Now, it's the case for, regarding the ICC, it's the case for Burundi, because an investigation had been opened into Burundi. It's not the case for Ethiopia or other situations. And Ethiopia, of course, there are strong concerns that the work that has been done by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, there was a joint report, that this work will not actually lead to accountability because it will be in front of Ethiopian national courts and tribunals as part of also a transitional justice process that's flowed. So it's not easy to address your question because the HRC is a political body. It can create independent mechanisms like investigative mechanisms, COIs, FFMs, that do legal work, that facilitate accountability, but the HRC itself is and will remain political. It's an intergovernmental body. So if one day states decide to discontinue a mechanism, and we saw it for Ethiopia, we saw it for Yemen the year before, or 2 years before. We see it for other situations. Libya, I think, is the last. In that case, in terms of the political will, there's not much we NGOs can do. We can, of course, push for the re-establishment of these mechanisms, or for the establishment of similar mechanisms. Colleagues do it on Yemen. A number of us have been doing it on Ethiopia, saying that basically we need an international investigative mechanism. But without the political will by states, it will not lead to action in terms of a resolution at the Human Rights Council that creates or that extends mechanisms. So in that case, we have to rely on what we can. That means criminal accountability processes wherever possible, if not effective at the national level, as most probably is the case for Ethiopia, perhaps elsewhere at the regional level, in other states, in line with universal jurisdiction. And we have to rely, on the other hand, on the political or moral aspect of accountability. The reports of these mechanisms, once again, will stay, can be used for advocacy, and can be used by the victims and survivors to try to hold accountable those responsible. Again, if not criminally, at least politically, at least to put pressure on them so they are not forgotten.
Excellent. I want to pick up on two things you said, but just on that last point about victims and survivors, do you have any stories of how the work of the HRC has directly impacted victims and survivors already?
Yeah, there are many stories. Burundi, South Sudan come to mind, but maybe I will address your question by referring to Eritrea. All Eritrean human rights defenders, journalists, civil society organizations, the independent ones, are in exile. No one can operate independently in the country because the state is so repressive that that would put you at risk immediately. So there are no independent HRDs and civil society organizations and media outlets operating within Eritrea. Which means that the Eritrean human rights community is in exile. For years, they advocated for attention to Eritrea at the international level. They used first the complaint procedure of the Human Rights Council, which is confidential initially. They were successful in bringing Eritrea to the agenda of the Human Rights Council through that procedure. And after some time, states decided to make the procedure public. And that led to the creation in 2012 of the Special Rapporteur on Eritrea, the special procedure, with the mandate basically to monitor and report on the human rights situation in Eritrea to the Human Rights Council. But for the HRDs that were leading the initiative, that was not enough, and they continued to advocate for an investigative mechanism, commission of inquiry. And that led in 2014 to the creation of the COI on Eritrea. And you cannot imagine the joy that advocates, human rights defenders, felt when the COI on Eritrea was created, because it meant that for the first time there was significant international attention to their country and to the violations committed by the authorities. It was the very first time. Many people didn't even know the name of Eritrea. Of course, since then, we've had two reports by the COI on Eritrea, 2015, 2016, and then the COI was discontinued. And let's say some of the hopes that HRDs had regarding accountability were not fulfilled. They felt disappointment that the work of the COI and the Special Rapporteur have not led to holding those responsible criminally accountable. That being said, they and we still use the findings of the COI on Eritrea. Since then, the attention has decreased, but it has never decreased to the level it was before 2012 or 2014. Because before that, there was virtually no international attention to the human rights situation in Eritrea. At the same time, there's been initiatives at the national level, including in Canada, regarding the use of forced labor by a private company with prosecutions. So the efforts continue. But that's a story of impact because Eritreans, due to the COI on Eritrea, even if it was there only for 2 years, Eritreans felt that they were not forgotten by the international community. And the special rapporteur, the COI, now it's back to a special rapporteur, of course, provide a vital link for victims, survivors, Eritreans in exile in the diaspora to the international system, and for their a vital link for their violations to find their way to international reporting.
That's really incredible and obviously very powerful for those communities. The other thing you mentioned that I wanted to pick up on is you sort of said that the mechanisms and international accountability tools, there was kind of a bridging of the gap between how they did their work and the impact it can have on prosecutions. And it kind of really highlighted for me that you've personally worked with the UN human rights system for over a decade. The HRC will soon be commemorating its 20th anniversary in 2026. So, in a sense, you've seen the institution and everything it can create grow up. So, looking back, how would you assess kind of the role and impact of the HRC over this time? And particularly, how have changing dynamics on the council and within the resolutions it passes addressed a lot of gaps that may have existed in the earlier years?
So the evolution is actually contrary to what the average person may think. The evolution has been that the HRC has established over the years more and more of these investigations. Despite the polarization, despite the politics, the tensions, the irreconcilable views of groups of states, the HRC is actually effective in fulfilling that part of its mandate, which is the part on addressing violations, including gross and systematic violations. So that mandate, that part of the mandate of the HRC, provides a strong legitimacy to these mechanisms. Even if they are almost all of them, they are put to a vote. The resolutions are put to a vote. It's not by consensus. Of course, groups of states always disagree, and there are strong opponents to these investigative mechanisms: China, Cuba, Russia, Venezuela, Vietnam, and so on. But despite this opposition, the HRC has created over the years more and more of these mechanisms. So you were talking about bridging the gap, or I was talking about bridging the gap. I think what we've seen over time is really that the work on the standard of proof. Now it's clear that for all of these mechanisms, it's reasonable grounds to believe, and the evidentiary requirements. And we've seen a lot of work by these mechanisms to try and preserve evidence, including linkage evidence that connects specific crimes to perpetrators, and working on the chain of custody to preserve the evidence collected. The OHCHR has recently set up Human Rights Inquiries branch, reorganizing its work on investigative mechanisms, in its work supporting investigative mechanisms. So I think OHCHR will also be better equipped to preserve over time the evidence collected by these mechanisms, even when they are discontinued. The ones on Ethiopia, for instance, the past ones on the Middle East, Israel, OPT, the one on Yemen, and there are a number of them. And on our side, civil society, what we've tried to do is when we advocate for the creation of a new investigative mechanism, try to streamline the elements of the mandates of recent international investigative mechanisms. Make sure that they have the same kind of functions, responsibilities. So basically, the first part would be investigations into both allegations of violations and abuses of international human rights law, and violations of international humanitarian law, with sometimes for some of these mandates elements on refugee law. Also establishing the facts and circumstances of violations. So that's the first part. The second is in terms of evidence collection and preservation, and in terms of identification of those individuals or entities responsible. So that's the second part, accountability, facilitating accountability, preparing case files for prosecution. The third part, and we've done it recently on Sudan, colleagues have done it for Ukraine, the COI on Ukraine, and I think it's the case for all recent investigative mechanisms, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, OPT, and so on. There are elements on gender, so gendered violations, gender aspects. There are elements on victims and survivors and specific groups affected by the violations. And several of these mechanisms have had in their mandate specifically mentioned a victim-centered approach. So that's number 3. I would say number 4 is an element on transitional justice. Many of these mechanisms, and virtually all the recent ones, have elements on providing guidance on transitional justice, on accountability, but also reconciliation and healing. Number 5, I would say that all of these mechanisms now have an element on engagement with all relevant stakeholders. So they include, of course, national governments, where relevant regional state governments, national human rights institutions, NGOs, civil society, of course, victims, survivors, human rights defenders, but also regional bodies and mechanisms. In the case of Sudan, for instance, African Union, Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, ACHPL. And finally, number 6, and I think partly that's due to the mandate as outlined by Human Rights Council resolutions, and partly it's due to innovations by these mechanisms and the Secretariat. You have had a number of these mechanisms do investigations on, for instance, economic crimes, the political economy of conflicts. A number of them have resorted to open source investigations, to forensic tools, and several of them have elements on addressing not just current violations, but the root causes of violations. So going back to the past, and I think that's clear for recent ones, Sudan, Ukraine, OPT, Israel, this element of root causes, which goes hand in hand with patterns. So not only investigating individual instances of violations, but also establishing patterns of violations and how they connect to the past and previous cycles of violations.
Excellent. I think that's, it's really encouraging to see how much these tools have advanced through the years, and also, kind of the fact that it's not just the political side making these changes. It's not just, civil society advocating for them. It's also innovation within the system and by OHCHR and the mechanisms themselves. And it's also good to hear, that there is a much more holistic approach. It's not just about documenting human rights. It's really looking at the entirety of a situation, as you mentioned with the kind of economic side of things that they're also looking at now. Looking ahead, what do you see on the horizon for the HRC? In what ways do you feel it could be even better at meeting the needs of affected communities and preventing atrocities?
Yeah, so I should mention challenges. As you know, there's a liquidity crisis at the UN, and it's ongoing, and it's likely to continue into 2025. So to make a long story short, there's a budget for the UN and for its human rights pillar every year. But state contributions, basically membership dues by UN member states, do not match this budget. So there is a gap between the budget that's approved and liquidity. So there's a liquidity crisis, which means that the UN and OHCHR, among all the UN entities, OHCHR is part of the UN Secretariat. OHCHR has to prioritize a number of activities, and that means basically, first and foremost, paying salaries of staff. And that means also that there is a freeze on, or there was actually in 2024 a freeze on recruitments, which has meant for the FFM on Sudan, for instance, that there were significant delays in staffing the FFM because of this liquidity crisis. So that's the challenge, the main challenge for these investigative mechanisms, being adequately resourced and staffed. I think there are a number of other challenges, and that will lead me to how these mechanisms can improve. I think there's not enough or not a sufficient mechanism to protect witnesses and victims. And in some cases, it's virtually no way of ensuring that victims and witnesses are protected. So there's a lot to do in this regard that would, of course, come with significant budget implications. But I think that's an area for the future, for investigative mechanisms to reflect, and for, of course, states that are behind the resolutions that establish these mechanisms to reflect. And in the meantime, we can, of course, strengthen reprisals, anti-reprisals mechanisms at the UN level. For instance, the Assistant Secretary General at OHCHR, head of New York office, is in charge of reprisals, and there's probably more she could do to protect those who engage with investigative mechanisms. I think another challenge is dissemination of findings, including dissemination in local languages is often an issue. For Burundi, for instance, Kirundi, I think the COI made efforts to have documents translated into Kirundi, but not all documents, of course, were, and not all reports were translated into Kirundi. And the same goes for other situations, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and of course in other regions around the world. I think another challenge is the use of technical language, legal language. I mean, of course, these mechanisms are independent mechanisms that apply the law, international human rights law and international humanitarian law mostly. It's technical, it's difficult, but I think there's more to do to make sure that the findings are disseminated in a language that people who are not versed in legal language can understand. Also to bridge the gap between the UN level and the ground. So these are areas for progress, for improvements. Again, these investigative mechanisms have done a lot of work in the last few years to try and bridge the gap between the evidentiary requirements that they used to use and the evidentiary requirements that an entity like the ICC uses, which is, of course, very high. And the last point, maybe, I'm looking at my notes, the last point was trying to strengthen synergies between the UN, Human Rights Council, and regional bodies and mechanisms like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, ACHPR, which also has a mandate to establish investigative mechanisms. Actually, the ACHPR has, for instance, established its own FFM on Sudan, but we don't really see in practice cooperation, coordination, complementarity as is emphasized by respective resolutions. So that's definitely an area for progress and improvement, although, of course, there's not much the UN and the Human Rights Council can do to ensure that the ACHPR is adequately funded by the African Union.
What are civil society organizations like yours doing to help facilitate these improvements at the HRC?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to emphasize the fact that civil society in Geneva, but also on the ground, all those who engage with the HRC and its organizations like DefendDefenders for Africa, but there are others, Forum Asia for Asia, the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies for the Middle East and North Africa, and of course, international NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and GCR2P, of course, on anything related to atrocity prevention. There's a lot of things we do to both to fight the narrative of double standards. There are groups of states accusing other groups of states, and I think actually all accusations are valid to some extent, accusing others to apply double standards. They accuse them of looking at a situation but not at another, of promoting accountability in one case but not in the other case. So all these accusations are valid to some extent, but in terms of civil society, what we do is try to fight these narratives by pushing for the use of objective criteria for the creation and extension of these investigative mechanisms. And the second thing is that Sudan is the key example there. We've tried to help streamline the mandates of these mechanisms. For instance, when we drafted the letter that was the initiative behind the creation of the FFM on Sudan, when we drafted that letter, we looked at mandates, especially the mandate of the COI on Ukraine, but also other mandates of investigative mechanisms. And we tried to make sure that all the relevant elements were taken up. So elements on collecting, consolidating, analyzing evidence, preserving information and evidence, identifying those responsible, those individuals and entities responsible, the gender aspect, and so on. We try to make sure that all these elements that are great, that are part of model investigative mechanisms like the COI on Ukraine, all these elements were taken up and found their way into other mandates, like the mandate of the FFM on Sudan. And I think that's the way to go. And in the future, advocacy by civil society, I'm not saying that all resolutions will actually include all of these elements, but at least advocacy by civil society will include all of these elements wherever they are relevant. So I think we are doing our part to try and strengthen and streamline these international investigative mechanisms. But of course, now we need states to act, and we need OHCHR to fully support through its new human rights inquiries branch to fully support these investigative mechanisms.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and would be grateful if you left us a review. For more information on the Global Center's work on R2P, mass atrocity prevention, and populations at risk of mass atrocities, visit our website at www.globalr2p.org and connect with us on Twitter and Facebook at GCR2P.